Pull up a chart of a portfolio that grows for 30 years and your eye lies to you immediately. It looks like a slow hill, a gentle climb where every year adds a little more than the last. That picture is wrong, and believing it is what quietly ruins people. The real chart is a flat line that lies there, barely moving, for a long, boring stretch. And then, near the very end, it stops being a line and becomes a wall. Straight up. You've been taught that getting rich is gradual, that the money you build is roughly proportional to the years you put in. A little effort, a little reward, repeated patiently until you're old. It's the most reasonable sounding idea in personal finance, and it sets a trap. Because if the growth is backloaded, if most of the fortune is manufactured in a handful of years at the end, then the flat stretch isn't a slow start. It's a test. And almost everyone who fails at the exact same place. They walk away during the flat part in the years right before the line goes vertical. I'm going to show you the precise year your portfolio stops being something you build and starts being something that builds itself. A year you can calculate, not guess. And you'll see why the single most expensive thing an investor can do is quit in the 7 years right before that line finally moves. 20 years into this math, a portfolio has produced only about a third of its final size. 2/3 of the money doesn't exist yet. Most people, staring at that number, conclude it isn't working. They're looking at the fuse and calling it a dud. None of this rests on a hot stock or a clever trade. It's arithmetic, the same arithmetic sitting inside every retirement account in the country. Let me walk you into it slowly because the punchline sounds made up until you see each step. Here is the whole engine in one idea. Compound growth doesn't move in a straight line, it moves in doublings. Money left to compound reaches a point where it's twice what it was, and then it takes the same stretch of time to double again. And again. And each of those doublings is larger in raw dollars than everything that came before it stacked together. That last part is the piece almost nobody internalizes. When your money doubles from 1,000 to 2,000, the growth was $1,000. Fine, but when it doubles the last time from 1 million to 2, that single doubling created $1 million, more than the entire history of the account up to that morning. Same doubling. Wildly different amount of wealth because it's a percentage of a much bigger number. The early doublings are rehearsals, the final one is the whole show. And these doublings run on a clock you can actually read. There's an old shortcut called the Rule of 72. Divide 72 by your yearly return and you get the years it takes your money to double. At the stock market's long-run return, that's the number that matters here. Over nearly a century, since 1926, the S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% a year with dividends reinvested, a figure documented across datasets like NYU Stearns. 72 divided by 10 is a little over 7. So at market average growth, your money doubles about every 7 years, no matter where you start on the curve. Hold on to that because it's the mechanism behind the wall. If the doublings are evenly spaced, but each one is dramatically bigger than the last, then the chart has to look flat for a long time and violent at the end. It isn't a mood the market is in, it's a mathematical certainty baked into the shape. Let me put two people inside this math because a curve is abstract and a person isn't. Meet Dan and Marcus. I've made their financial lives identical on purpose. Every variable locked to the same value except one, so that whatever separates them at the end can only be that one thing. Same age. Both start at 30, both aiming to retire at 60. 30 years of runway to the month. Same income. Same habit. Each one puts $1,000 into a plain index fund every month automatically. Over the full 30 years, that's $360,000 of their own money going in, dollar for dollar, no difference between them. Same market too. Both earn that same long-run 10%, riding the identical curve we just built. If you're waiting for the twist, there isn't one yet. Right now, Dan and Marcus are the same person twice. Same paycheck, same contribution, same returns, same finish line. The only thing that will ever differ is what each of them chooses to do at one specific moment, a moment years from now when the chart is sitting in that long flat stretch and the balance looks like it's going nowhere. One of them holds, the other one looks at that flat line and makes a decision that feels responsible and costs him a fortune, But that decision doesn't matter until we understand what the flat stretch actually is. So let's run their shared curve first, the part where they're still identical, and find the exact year the ground shifts under both of them without either one noticing. 10 years in, Dan and Marcus have each put in $120,000 of contributions, and the account holds about $200,000. A decade of discipline, and the market has added roughly $80,000 on top of what they saved. Respectable. Nothing that makes your jaw drop. If you quit reading the story here, you'd shrug. 20 years in, two-thirds of the entire journey behind them, the balance sits around $724,000. And here's the number that fools people. That's only about a third of what this account will eventually be worth. 2 decades of never missing a payment, and roughly two-thirds of the final fortune still doesn't exist. This is the flat stretch. This is exactly where it feels like the plan is failing. Then the last third of the time runs, and the account crosses 2 million. Same thousand a month, same market. The final decade does something the first two couldn't. Now rewind to the moment the physics actually changed, because it's earlier and quieter than you'd think. Every year, two forces add money to the account, the $12,000 the person contributes, and whatever the market throws off on the balance already sitting there. For the first several years, the contribution is the bigger of the two. You are the engine. Then, in year 8, the market's gain for the year crosses $12,600 and passes your $12,000 of contributions. From that year forward, the money is earning more per year than you are adding to it, and it never gives that lead back. That's the real turning point, year 8, with only about $144,000 in the account. Nothing announced it. No statement flagged it. But that's the year the account quietly stopped being something Dan and Marcus were building and became something that was building itself, with them along for the ride. Everything dramatic that happens at the end is just this handover compounding on itself for 2 more decades. So why does the end look like a wall? Go back to the doublings. Watch where the biggest one lands. At the end of year 23, after more than 2 decades of paying in, Dan and Marcus each have about $1,005,000. Call that the reward for 23 years of showing up. Now watch only the last 7 years, years 24 through 30. In that single stretch, the account grows by $1,073,000. Sit with the comparison because it's the whole video. Those final 7 years produce more wealth than the first 23 combined. 7 years, out-earning 23. That is the last doubling, and it is larger than the entire history that built up to it. And here's the part that rearranges how you think about the whole thing. In those 7 explosive years, how much of that million did Dan and Marcus actually contribute out of their own pockets? $84,000, 7 years of $1,000 a month. Every remaining dollar, $990,000 of it, was manufactured by the market working on the balance that was already there. Their saving was almost irrelevant by then. The pile had gotten big enough to do the heavy lifting on its own, which means the flat stretch was never dead time. It was loading. Those slow, discouraging years in the middle weren't the plan failing to work. They were the plan assembling the one thing the final doubling needs to be enormous. A large balance for the percentage to bite into. The boring part builds the base. The base is what makes the wall. You cannot have the vertical ending without first living through the flat middle that everyone mistakes for failure. Now we've earned the moment Dan and Marcus finally split. It happens at year 20, deep in the flat stretch. Balance around $724,000, that discouraging point where only a third of the fortune exists and the wall is still a decade away, invisible. Both men look at the same number and have the same thought everyone has here. 20 years? And this is it? Marcus sits with the discomfort and does nothing. He keeps holding, keeps contributing, and lets the last decade run. He ends at that full $2,079,000. Dan decides to be responsible, but responsible splits into 2 very different moves, and the gap between them is the most important dollar figure in this video. Say Dan just stops contributing. He's tired of feeding it, but he leaves the money invested. He rides the curve without adding another cent. He still finishes with $1,878,000. Stopping his contributions for the final 10 years cost him about $200,000 because remember, his own deposits were never the engine anymore. He still captured 90% of the maximum by doing nothing but staying in the market. Now, the other version of responsible, the one that feels even safer and is catastrophic. Dan looks at that flat balance, decides the market is going nowhere, and pulls the money out into cash to be safe. He locks in 724,000. That's it. That's his retirement. He didn't stop feeding the machine. He unplugged it 1 year before it started its real work. Staying in but ceasing to contribute cost 200,000. Selling out cost 1,355,000, nearly 7 times as much. The expensive mistake was never failing to save more at the end. It was flinching during the flat part and stepping off the curve right before the curve did everything it existed to do. A video that stopped there would be selling you a fantasy with clean edges, so let's rough them up where the real world does. First, that 10% is an average, not a promise. And averages hide almost everything that matters. Across the last 90-plus years, the S&P landed within a couple of points of its 10% average in only 6 of them. 6. Most years were dramatically higher or lower. The curve I drew is smooth, the one you'll actually live is jagged, and the timing is not yours to choose. If your last doubling, those decisive final 7 years, happens to overlap a brutal stretch for the market, the wall arrives shorter and later than the arithmetic suggests. The shape is reliable. The schedule is not. Second, every dollar here is nominal. That 2 million is in future dollars, not today's. Strip out inflation, and the market's long-run real return is closer to 7%, which means the number that actually buys groceries in 30 years is meaningfully smaller than the headline. The doublings still happen. They just happen in money that's quietly worth less each year. I'd rather you hold the honest figure than the flattering one. And third, the most uncomfortable one. The math assumes a person who simply stays in for 30 years. And that person is rarer than you'd think. Studies of real investor behavior have pegged the average investor's actual return at under 3% a year, nowhere near the 10 the market handed out. The gap isn't fees. It's exactly the mistake we just watched Dan make. Getting scared during the flat parts, selling near the bottoms, sitting in cash through the recoveries, which flips this whole thing around. The lesson isn't throw every dollar in and never think again. Markets can fall hard right when you need the money, and this is not a nudge to bet money you'll need soon. The lesson is narrower and sturdier than that. Whatever you've decided to invest for the long haul, the flat stretch is the one stretch you cannot afford to abandon. The danger was never the math. It was the human staring at a boring chart. So here's what to do with this while it's still useful. And it takes about 30 seconds. Find your turning point. Take whatever you put into the market in a year and find the year your balance grows by more than that on its own. In our numbers, that was year 8 at around 144,000, the year the market started out contributing the contributor. Everyone's is a little different, but once you know roughly where yours sits, you know when you stop being the engine. Then mark the far end of the curve, the last stretch before your finish line, and label those years non-negotiable. That's where the wall gets built. Missing contributions there is forgivable. Your deposits aren't the engine by then anyway. Stepping out of the market there is the one move that can't be undone because you can't be handed the last doubling if you're not holding the asset when it happens. The last doubling, the final stretch of that flat-looking line, created more wealth than every decade that came before it combined. That's the year the market took over. Everyone who quit before it. And now you know exactly which years you can't afford to walk away from. If you want to run this on your own numbers, your contribution, your timeline, your finish line, and see the exact year your market gains overtake your savings and where your own wall gets built, that's one of the tools in the Wealth Logician's Vault. Same models, your inputs, no guessing. The link's below. Hit like if this changed the shape of the chart in your head. Subscribe if you want to do the math on the next one, because next time we take the one variable this video held perfectly still, the market's return, and let it move.